Good afternoon. Welcome to the Architectural Association. I'm Marco Poletto, and I'm a Unit Master of Intermediate Unit 10 here at the AA, and I'm Director of ecoLogicStudio, which is a small research design practice here in London. In ecologic, we actually collaborate recently with Simply Rhino in organizing a series of advanced design workshops here in London, which maybe you can have some more detail about that later on. But this event is a little bit part of this workshop series, which really is about exploring how a platform like Grasshopper is opening up new possibilities in effectively sketching or developing architectural concepts computationally. So with the mean of logic and computation. So the title of this event today is Computing Architectural Concepts, and it is really to try and put emphasis on these aspects and let's say these kind of revolutionary aspects, if you want, a little bit of Grasshopper, of that Grasshopper is bringing. My guess as a user is that perhaps it's actually due to the new interface that this software is bringing, which actually allows architect and designer to interfere with it much more directly, much more visually. And maybe it's not a chance that the developer of this, David Rutten, has been trained as an architect in the Technical University of Delft. So we will discover maybe later from his world if there is some connection or not in that. But basically, let's get on to the content of the lecture. I think today what we want to explore is really how this, let's say, new way of sketching computationally is allowing, let's say, to blur the boundaries also between disciplines. And in fact, today David will talk about a new evolutionary solver, as he called it, for Grasshopper, which is called Galapagos. And for me, it's actually quite exciting to see this presented here today. If you think about in this school, around 25 years ago, there was a professor called John Fraser who actually did a pioneering work in evolutionary architecture. And in order to test his ideas or his convictions, he had to go all the way outside of the discipline, if you want. He had to build up his own software, he has to build up his own interfaces, his own platform. He had to completely build up the whole infrastructure going really far away. Whereas now, 25 years later, we actually can explore these ideas, let's say, within our let's say, usual environment, the one of architecture, thanks to this new apparatus. I think that is for me quite exciting. David will then be followed by a few other presentations. One is from Daniel Picker. He's a sort of independent, let's say, developer, if you want, and actually former student here at the Architectural Association. So you'll see what actually you may be interested in doing next. And he's developed a little plugin which is called Kangaroo. And it is instead operating, let's say, on the borderline between physics and architecture, if you want. So not so much about biological mechanisms like the Galapagos one, but more about bringing the processes of physical space, like gravity and material properties, within the platform of Grasshopper, which is, of course, another quite exciting explorations. And finally, we have John Mirshin, which is going to introduce a geometry gym, which, as suggests the title, is really about geometry and mathematics. He will show how, through this platform, models can be exported in other platforms much more seamlessly, but also how you can begin to explore surface tessellation or perhaps relaxation, minimal surface algorithms within Grasshopper. Then a final note will be a presentation from 3 students from Inter10, from my unit. And this year we've been working in Dubai on a project which is called Marine Life Incubators, which really, again, is at the borderline between biology, marine biology in this case, and architecture. So they will briefly show a few examples from the user point of view and to complete the package, and then obviously some question and answer at the end. We'll try to keep everything within 2 hours, so it's going to be quite a brief and agile, but if you have any question, you can obviously remember it for the end and for the question and answer session. Before just moving directly to the presentation, I just want to thank obviously Simply Rhino, with which we are collaborating, and Paul Cowell in particular, which should be somewhere around here. Paul, if you want to just come. And of course they've been helping, like bringing these friends with us and introducing. Maybe I just let him introduce himself, and then we quickly move to David Rutten for the first presentation. Thanks.
Great, thanks Marco. Marco's really done a great introduction there, so there's not much for me to say, other than thank you all for making the effort for coming here today. I know some of you have come from not just London, but parts of Europe, and even some people are coming from the States for this presentation today, which was great to see that level of interest and dedication to these subjects. That's it really. So I just want to hand over to David and maybe get a chance to talk to some of you after the event. I think Marco mentioned there's a canteen upstairs. You're all invited to join us up there after after 3 o'clock. Okay. Hope to see you later.
Good afternoon. It's quite a full room here, so I'm nervous. I've been asked to talk about, first of all, the history of Grasshopper and a bit of myself, how it all came to be. So I'll try to rush this through in a few minutes and highlight the key events in history that actually led up to this software. Of course, most of which I actually can't take credit for. A long time ago, some Greek chap named Euclid wrote some books on geometry, and it's actually one of the oldest books that is still around, and it's been printed the most. It's second only to the Bible. These books have been around for a long time, and we haven't really improved on them in terms of geometry. So, if you think that you're all on the cutting edge, he was on the cutting edge. In 1947, William Shockley made the transistor, and the age of computation began, because now you can actually have circuit boards, you have calculators, you have very, very fast computation. He won a Nobel Prize for that as well, I think rightly so. In 1963, we have the first CAD application written by Sutherland called Sketchpad. And as you can see here, he's actually using a pen to sketch on the screen. So that's pretty advanced for the very first CAD app. I also believe that this phone in the upper left corner was instrumental in the first CAD tech support call, but there's no record of that. 1977, CATIA is the first commercially successful CAD application. It was written by Dassault, mostly to help with Mirage jet fighter design. But soon it was adopted by boat builders, car builders, and so on and so forth. About 3 years later, I was born, which might be a coincidence, but you decide on that. After I was born, I went to TU Delft, architecture and urbanism. And in my second year, I got frustrated with the lack of scientific approach in the design courses. It seemed that all the designs were based on either emotional or at best philosophical considerations. And I wanted to see numbers. I wanted to actually see proof that a design is better than something else. So I started programming to accomplish this. And as many of you may know, it's actually burned down recently. And I didn't want to say in public that I had absolutely nothing to do with that at all. In fact, at the time I was in Finland, so I have an alibi. The reason I was in Finland is because I was hired by McNeil, the people who make Rhino. And at the time I was making Grasshopper, the first few versions, in a small office in Finland where it's pretty cold most of the time. Do I speak in here? Okay. At first I made it in secret, and when I say secret I actually mean real secret. People didn't know about it, my boss didn't know about it, it was just all me in my free time. Because I was worried that if it became known in a company, that people would want in, and then you get a committee, and once you get a committee you're screwed. So after it was reasonably showable for the first time in 2008, I showed it to the world and the office, and I've been working on this full time on my own ever since then. I've also moved away from Finland. I'm now in Slovakia, where there's more mountains and less snow, and I work from basically my home, so it's quite relaxed. And this is yesterday, the last version. So I'll show you how this works briefly, because I will assume that at least some of you haven't seen it before or haven't used it before. Oh yeah, to dispel the notion that all software is written in ugly white buildings. It's just people in their garages. It still happens this way. So this is not how Rhino or Grasshopper is made, or indeed how Geometry Gym is made or Kangaroo is made. People use words to describe things like Grasshopper, and typically they're pretty buzzy kind of words, but they don't tell you much, and they are laden with notations. So I prefer to just show you how it works. And this is a very, very simple example of a Grasshopper file. And it consists of two main elements. There's data, and there are actions. So we start with data, always. In this case, there's 2 points. And those 2 points flow into an action, and the action creates new data. In this case, it's a component that takes 2 points and creates a new line. Also, we can have more data as numbers or text or surfaces or whatever, and that feeds into yet more actions which generate more data, and so on down the line. So all these steps are like lines in source code, basically. It's just, there's no code. So let's do this in real time here. I have 2 points which are imported from, say, Rhino. Let's snap off. Here we have data objects which can be linked to geometry in Rhino. Point 1, point 2. An action is to make a line between 2 points. So between A and B, we get now a line segment, which becomes the new data. We also had a slider, which went from 0 to 10. Then we had a divide component, which takes a curve and the number of divisions. So now I get control the number of points on this curve. And the last step here was to actually make a surface on these points. And it's quite big, so I'll change the points, and it changes the line, and it changes the divisions, and it changes the spheres. So it's all, in this sense, it's all parametric. So that's basically how it works. All of it. I mean, it looks quite expensive, but it's all the same system. Good. Now that we've got this out of the way, I'd actually like to talk about Galapagos, which is a fairly new development. I started this about 2 months ago. And it employs evolution to find fitness in designs. I'd like to first talk about actual evolution, in case somebody hasn't read Selfish Gene, which is probably a few of you. There's 3 core principles, and if you have those 3, then it becomes almost capable to actually have evolution over time. The first is variation. If there is no variation, then you can't pick something which is better than something else, and the whole thing grinds to a halt. Second is inheritance. If mommy is fit and daddy is fit, and then we expect the child to also be fit. If that doesn't happen, then you can't go over time and be consistent. And finally, there is selection. If you're unfit, you don't get a mate. That's the basic rule. Either because you're sterile, or because you die too soon, or because you can't find a mate, or whatever. So the most fit individuals make the next generation. Now, these 3 are the same everywhere where there's evolution, but there are large differences between biological evolution and software evolution. I'll just note a few here. First of all, in life actually has an environment, and it changes on seasons, on years. It changes by volcanic eruptions or whatever. So it always aiming at a moving target, whereas in software, we tend to know that we have one outcome, one result, and once we're there, we're done, we're finished. So that's a big difference. Secondly, there's populations. The most important part about a wildebeest and an environment is other wildebeests, because they eat your grass, they cheat with your wife, and they actually run faster when the lines show up. So we have genomes interacting with other genomes of the same species a lot. That also doesn't happen much in software. You have one instance which just is measured on its own qualities, not on its cooperation or cheating abilities. There's no actual sex, of course, in software, as you all know. We're geeks and we don't have sex. There's also no genders, really, typically. There's just very abstract genomes. Very rarely will you see dominance or recessive genes in software simulations. It's just too complex. It's too arbitrary. We just use one gene with one value, which gets blended in between values over time. Also, real life has thousands of genes and millions of base pairs. We're lucky to have maybe a dozen, maybe a couple dozen. That's like the maximum number of inputs for a simulation. This is a very big part. Evolution works by some mechanisms such as meiosis or mitosis and RNA protein links. And actually those mechanisms are subject to evolution themselves. So you get stuff like viruses, which take the mechanism of evolution and change it, or meiotic drive genes which change it. This is also very, very abstract stuff that doesn't happen in software. It's all much simpler in the computer. And finally, and most importantly, genes are code. Real genes are instructions that get actually run, whereas in software it's almost always just data which gets either 1 or 2 or 3 and then shifted back and forth again. So this is a very simple fitness landscape for 2 genes, gene A on the right and gene B on the left. And when you have a value of gene A somewhere along this line and a value of gene B, you end up somewhere on this fitness landscape. And if you're lucky, you're somewhere near a peak. If you're unfit, you're somewhere on the plains. So what we do is we first of all create a random population. Hang on. This landscape is of course not known to anybody. I mean, it's consists of thousands of points, or that we actually have to search. So you can't stand here and say, well, there's a high peak, I'll just start walking in this direction. You can only see your local little area, and you can see that it's sloping upwards here and downwards there, so you start walking upwards. But by doing so, you might get stuck on a low hill, because you walk up the hill, and then you're at the summit and you're stuck, because it's always downhill from wherever you are. So each summit has a basin of attraction around it. And if you're over here, chances are you'll end up on this summit. If you're over here, then you'll end up on this summit. In the middle, it's a bit blurry because of mutations and breeding. It doesn't get very sharp, but that's the basic idea. So we begin with just a random population of individuals on this surface, and we take the fittest ones, so we discard the ones that are not fit. These are the ones that get to mate, and you can already see here that there's 2 subpopulations, one on this hill and one on this hill. So if they mate together, you'll get children somewhere inside this area here. And again, the border is not sharp, it's fuzzy because of mutations. But eventually, we expect children to slowly climb up the hill here until they reach the summit. I'll skip this for later. So I'll show you a very simple example of, let's see. No, thank you. What I have here is a definition that uses a hang chain, or catenary, between 2 points. 1, 2. Yes, those are my points from last time. And I can change the length of this chain, and as it gets longer, it hangs slower. And what I want to solve here is I want to make this chain intersect that point. So it has to pick a length that matches about this length. There's only one gene, which is currently being solved, and there's here one fitness. I can run this, and it should complete quite quickly because it's a very simple setup. See where it runs? It tries to find a point, and after about 10 generations, it actually found an answer, which is very, very accurate. And it's still trying to find something better, but it probably won't be able to. So I'm going to stop it here. This progression is it's very typical. It always goes up very, very quickly in the beginning, and then it flattens out, because after about 10, 20 generations, the optimum has been reached, or very closely been approximated. So if we zoom in here, you can see that it actually gave a pretty good answer. It came to within 4e minus 5, which is like about a hair, I think. Okay, so let's make this a bit more complicated. Let's go for not just one gene, but 3 genes. Now I have 3 sliders here. One which controls the left point of the catenary, one which controls the right point, and the third one which controls the length of this chain. And I wanted to hit all 3 points at the same time. So this is a bit more complicated here. It should probably take longer to solve, but the principle is the same. It just generates random points, it picks the best ones, and elaborates on those. At the moment, it has a pretty bad solution. It's still off here. But hopefully, after a while, it should actually try and go towards that point. It's just going to take some time to run this solution. And if it doesn't find it, that's just bad luck. But apparently it didn't find it. Let's try again. Especially with a small population like here, there's maybe only like 20 points. It's very hard to find good solutions. You typically need at least 50 or 100 individuals to get a good, reliable answer. In this case, it's slightly better. Right. So I'll show you now something which has a lot of points, and there's some interesting effects here. The basic setup is very simple, but it uses this surface, which is actually very complicated. It has a very weird shape. And what I'm doing here is I'm just trying to find the highest point. Now, as you can see, these 3 hills are the same height. So there is no one answer for this question. But any one of those will do. We have here 3 hills close together, and here 2 hills close together. And we have lots of individuals here. And each one will pick a point on the surface, somewhere at random, and measure the height of it. What we should see over time is, first of all, it's going to be random again. It just be spread out. But then we should see one group of points on this cluster, and then as a second group on this cluster. So we should actually have 2 subpopulations. Then this one will most likely go extinct, because it's, on average, less fit than over here. So this one goes away. And then here we should see 2 subpopulations, one on this hill and one on this hill. It's going to take a while to run, because there's lots of points here, 400 in total. So at this point, if you have any questions, would be a good time as we wait.
Is this actually available in beta at the moment?
Sort of, yeah. It's hidden, but I can show you how to get this out of the latest version. So this is the first population, the random one. Random, and it's just completely amorphous. It's just all the points are in the same block. And over here we see a graph of the genomes. So on the left we have 1 slider, and here we have the second slider. And there's a point on the 1 slider, and this is 1 genome, it's a line. And after a while, we should see bands appear here, where there's combinations of fit values on both sliders. So we already have here a sort of band. There's a band here, and there's another band here, which corresponds probably with those 3 hills. One of the nice things about this sort of solver is that it always has an answer for you. It might not be a good answer, but it is an answer of sorts. So if you run this and you stop it in like half an hour, you will probably get something which is pretty close to what you want. Whereas an old-fashioned solver, which does one specific task is faster usually, but it has to complete all the way through before it actually has the outcome. Okay, so over here we had still a fairly blobous kind of population. Here we have a sort of split between a dense group here, which are the people on these two hills, and a somewhat more spread out group here, which is that group over here. And there's a quite a clear gap here between those two populations. As you can see here as well, that there's a very clear difference between those bands. And as we move on, that becomes more pronounced and more pronounced until this one just totally disappears. And again, now here we have a very dense group on one of these two hills and a somewhat less dense one on the other side of this twin peak. By the way, what you see here is the fitness of the whole population, the red line, average fitness. The yellow bit is the maximum and minimum fitness, and the yellow is the standard deviation, so it contains most of the individuals. And as it goes up, of course, it gets fitter, but we see here that the fittest individual from the first generation was actually so fit by random chance that it hasn't really improved yet so far. I can make this logarithmic, in which you can see a very small difference, but it's really not that much. Now, the more genes you have, the less likely it is that you'll pick a good value by accident at the beginning. So, but with two genes, it happens a lot. Here you have all the individuals in one generation, where black dots are parents and red crosses are dead ends. They didn't mate. And this gives you, for all the genomes, the relative layout. Okay, so I'm going to stop it here. And it's going to give me the best answer it had so far, which apparently was over here, which looks pretty close to a good answer. There's one more example, which is not with geometry, but with just text, because this is not limited to any kind of shapes. It just runs on anything. In this case, I'll have a whole bunch of sliders, and each one controls its own little letter in this output text. So if I go start, it's all A. And after a while, it's space or letter in the alphabet. And what I wanted now to do is try and make something here like a sentence. So the fitness is a distance away from the real sentence now that I want. And this will honestly take forever. So we have about 50 individuals and 300 generations. And I think it won't actually find an answer until like generation 200. So we can use this time again for questions or to switch presentations. Yes, so you can see here for each gene, there's now many more vertical lines, because each gene has its own little valley or hill. And we'll also see that it takes a lot longer now to actually get this upper fitness. It will keep on going up and up and up and up and up for a long time to come. So questions? Yes. There's a bunch of options which make sense to change in this kind of setting. There is basically 4 kinds of options. You have mutations, point mutations, frequency, severity, that kind of thing. There's also mutations where it takes 2 values and swaps them around in the genome. And it can also add and remove genes, but when you have sliders, that doesn't really work very well, so no. Then there is coupling, which determines which genomes get to mate. So you can say, well, I want the top 10%, or I want fit genomes to be more likely to mate, but still give a chance to less fit genomes. There is coalescence, which is how two parent genomes are combined to form offspring genomes. So you can pick gene A from mommy, gene B from daddy, or you can interpolate between them, this kind of thing. And finally, there is an inbreeding factor, which is actually quite important. If you have two hills of fitness, you don't want people on this hill to mate with people on this hill, because their kids will fall in the valley in between. So you don't want to pick genomes that are too far away from you as a mate, but you also don't want genomes that are too nearby, because there's no variation. So it's some balance between incestuous and zoophilic mating, which is actually optimal. But it seems that 75% is like a very good estimate for that. So you can change it if you want to, but it's unlikely that you'll need it. It's still unreadable, isn't it? It's like, well, the first person to guess what it's supposed to say, I'll buy them lunch. No, it's actually a bit longer than that. It's just letters, no numbers.
The answer.
No, it's not the question. But you're pretty close, though. Do you read evolutionary biology as part of your courses, or just as part of interest? Because I think that there's a lot of useful things in evolution to actually apply to design and to apply to management even. And this has been a sort of private fascination of me for a long time, and I've wanted to write this for ages. But it was always a case of writing it for a very specific problem, whereas now I can actually write this for Grasshopper, and it's just kind of generic, so it's available to a lot of people for a lot of things. It's actually going quite a bit slower than my hotel room this morning. I think it was on my 150 at that point. So again, it's all random. So if you're unlucky, it's going to take longer. Or
Probably go to the meaning of life.
ooh, no, he already. Yes, that's it. The richness of life. You said that? Good. Please just ask questions.
So you've chosen basically to solve the problem with the aerobic chair. Have you compared it with any other optimization solvers? And one that springs to mind immediately is sampling, just randomly sampling your design space,
Mhm.
and then honing in on areas where you found good points already.
There are a number of ways to solve these kind of things. There's specific solutions, which you usually find answers in nanoseconds. And then you have things like evolution or simulated annealing, which do like uphill walks. So they start somewhere, and they just keep walking uphill until they find the proper spot, and then they hope it's the right answer. I haven't compared it, but if I were to compare it, I can tell you that it's going to be slower than pretty much anything else that you try to do. But it is very, very versatile. It's very flexible. It can do geometry, it can do text, it can do all kinds of things. So if you have time, good heavens, 250. If I scale here, you'll see that it's from the start. It went up, and slowly went up, and went up, and went up. So it didn't really go through that flattening out bit. Because so many genes, there's so many possible ways for this to change.
Can you talk about your attitude towards code? Yeah, I'm just curious. Do you see Grasshopper as an interface between the user and, just very daunting lines of code, or is it something a little more radical that changes the way coding works?
I don't think it's radical. I mean, this system has been around for years, right? Maya has had this kind of thing for a long time. I think it's basically best described as coding without text. So Visual Basic without the basic. Because it takes a long time to learn to code. Actually it takes like 10 years to do it really good, but it takes at least 2 months to get to the basic level. Whereas this is, within 1 day, you can already have something running. So it makes it a lot easier to start. Yeah. But then it's also harder to go further. It's easier to change a text-based program than it's to change this to do something weird.
I was just wondering, have you sort of, like in this case, for example, you have sort of a set fitness that you're getting to, right, with these work. Have you started to look at this in terms of making localized decisions within some sort of generative output or generative process? So, say something that's like an aggregate system or a system that builds upon itself and grows. Those localized decisions that it makes within each one, moving towards a system that you maybe don't know yet, right?
Yes, this is a very simple example, and it knows when it's there, right? The surface example is not quite so simple. I mean, it might have a very, very small, thin peak somewhere, which I just haven't found yet. So normally, you say that after X generations, if it hasn't improved, we call it quits. Say 15 or 20 generations. In this case, I say, well, when you have zero distance between the output and the input, you're there. Building multiple layers on top of each other is quite difficult and probably quite intensive in terms of memory and disk space, because this generates a lot of data, and it gets all thrown away whenever.
In terms of, let's say, you're building each one of those fitness landscapes you've shown, right? Let's say each one of those in some way is a fitness landscape of a building block or a unit of some kind, right? If they start to build upon each other, can you start to look at those as the building blocks, each one of them,
Yes.
making sort of localized decisions based on what it's already learned?
I think it might be. But basically, the number of points on the surface would affect the shape of the surface, right? That's what you mean by the genomes of affecting the environment. And for that to work, you'd have to somehow collect them all at the same time. And it's possible, but not in this current interface, no. Anyway, it's very hard in general to maintain information between runs in Grasshopper, because it always just gets reset, which is the bane, I think, of many people like John or well, especially actually Daniel, who wants to solve this thing in sequence. And in the meantime, his building deforms due to forces, but it still has to keep running on the new deformed geometry. So it's possible, but difficult.
I just wanted to ask, what were the fitness criteria for this example of the
The fitness function or the fitness?
criteria?
I'm sorry, there was a cough here.
Criteria.
It measures the distance between each letter and the one that it wants. So if it's an R and it's a Q, then there's a distance of 1 or 2. If it's an A, it's a larger distance. So basically, for each letter, it measures the number of letters in between the one it has and the one it wants. And actually, in this case, it's a bit cheating because I used a script to calculate the fitness. Because I actually don't think you can convert a number to a letter easily using standard components.
What does the genome look like?
The genome here is all of these numbers, where each number is a value between A and space. A, B, C, D, E, F, Z, space. You can see that first when they're changing as I drag the slider around. think I'm out of time, aren't I? Thank you.
My name's John Merchant. I'm a structural engineer from Australia. I've spent the last, I arrived in London about 5 years ago and joined Expedition as a structural engineer. Since then, I've actually formed my own company here in London, based on a number of tools and plugins and computation and geometry type calculations and things for architects and engineers. And I'm going to give you, in sort of 20 minutes or so, I've got an introduction into the nature of the tools and software and advice that I've been working on. And anyone can come and see later on, or as Paul mentioned, you can learn a lot more about it and the specific aspects of the jobs and tools and how you might use and apply them in your own work. Just a quick rundown on me. I've worked on a number of stadium and bridges which generally exhibit or display their geometry and form, and the form plays a large part in the shape that particular structural project works. So, and in working on these projects, we've really tried to push the software and the current available design techniques to produce these designs. So the tools and stuff that I'm presenting and making available are basically the culmination and combination of all those jobs and projects and the particular tasks and problems we faced in trying to design them. Basically, I'm going to show a whole, or 4 or 5 screen captures, basically demonstrating the tools that I have created, and they will, and so that will give you an idea of the tools and how they work. And I'm going to start out of, even though today's topic is basically Grasshopper, I'm going to start out of Grasshopper, but the same concepts and tools basically are extended into that platform, and I'll show it in use in Grasshopper for some of the more computational geometry type aspects. When dealing with structure and using these in projects, stadium, bridges, etc., part of what I had to develop was effectively profile libraries and databases of sections and things that you'd use. And obviously, I've tried to pick the best aspects out of a number of software programs that I've used in the day to create a better tool. And also, it does work parametrically similar in a way to Grasshopper. So you can actually apply that section profile to centerline curves, whether they be on the center or the top or a particular location point on that profile section. And then you can parametrically change it. So if you update your table property, it redraws that section. And that can either then be applied to curves in Rhino, or you can apply it to layers. So if you've applied it to layer 1 and then you draw a curve on layer 1, then it will draw that profile on that section. So, and again, like I said, this is showing initially starting to do it manually, but also by the same concept, you have a component in Grasshopper when you have the plugin installed, and you just feed the input in, whether it be a curve or points and the property number, etc. A large aspect, or one of the main reasons why you might model in Rhino, is it's fantastic with curves, with the NURB surfaces and curves. So in reality in Rhino, it doesn't care whether it's a straight line or an arc or a helix of some description. It will sweep that profile over that curve. So you have a lot more freedom in the shape and form that you can explore in a program like Rhino. Whether it can be cheaply built or fabricated might be another matter. The velodrome for 2012, which we're involved with at Expedition, I'm just going to show, because a large part, there's 2 aspects. There's the aspect of computational geometry, and there's also taking your design in Grasshopper and using it downstream, including building information modeling such as Revit, or taking your model to the fabricator for a Tekla steel detailing file, etc. So I've done a lot of work also in information or model representations and being able to exchange that model from Rhino or Grasshopper to the other CAD modeling programs, etc., that you might use in your office. And you don't typically have the dimensioning and annotations tools and some of the sectioning things, etc., in the Rhino platform. It's more a 3D modeling program. So it is important to be able to take that information and use it without trying to coordinate and build 3 or 4 different representations of your structure, because as every change happens, and particularly stadiums and bridges do change a lot, it's lots of repetitive work and very difficult to ensure you have coordinated and got all your different models and representations exactly the same. So there is the ability, basically, effectively, I've opened up here the structural analysis model, which we use the ARIP program, GSA, to assess the strength and the amount the stadium moves. And then you do then have the freedom and the flexibility to do all your geometrical manipulations in Rhino, which are not so powerful in the native structural analysis program, including working on groups or subsets of your model. Those lists can be used in the different environments the same as you can in your structural analysis program. The wonderful thing about Rhino, if you do like scripting or programming, is that it's such a powerful environment, and you can write your own little scripts to do things like change the colors of sublayers, do the various movements, even to generate this type of thing. And traditionally, the sort of means that have been used for trying to convey your model between one program to another has simply been a wireframe or centerline DXF or DWG file. But then if you've assigned your materials, if you've assigned your cross-section profiles, if you've assigned intelligence to the model you've created, that's all lost in using a primitive DWG format. Whereas by the sort of exchange format I've looked at, all that information's retained the same as a BIM or building information model, so that when you can take your data or your model out of one program, operate it on it in Rhino, and then take it back, and it basically just updates the changes and recognizes what line represents what cable in the roof, etc. Again, it's parametric in that effectively the nodes or the points are control points for the structure, and it has the intelligence to know that these particular cables or beams or etc. are connected to that point. So if that point moves, it knows to redraw the beams or the cables that are connected. The velodrome it was not a mathematical setout, but it did have symmetry in that the quadrants effectively mirrored round the stadium. So rather than make a change in one quadrant and then have to repeat it in the other three quadrants, again, repetitive work that's risk of an error, or not having the exact changes made in every quadrant. A little tool in Rhino I wrote for watching for symmetry. So you turn that on. If you move a node in one quadrant, it checks to see if there's any point in the other three quadrants with intolerance of that point, and adjusts it accordingly. So allows you to streamline and do your work a little bit more effectively. Okay, I thought if we start in Grasshopper then, and how you do also use the tool in that particular environment. Wembley Arch, it would have been fantastic to have a tool like Grasshopper to try and explore the arch. It is a structural feature of Wembley. It's not just an architectural icon of the stadium. And the arch tipping backwards stops the roof falling in, and the roof trying to fall in stops the arch from tipping over backwards. So it is a big counterbalance for the roof sitting over the seats. So of course you could explore the best inclination angle for that arch to meet that counterbalance. Also the appearance of the arch, that in Grasshopper, if you set up so that it does the spiral lattice parametrically, you can use the sliders to control the number of spiral or lattice spirals. You can control how many division points, and really explore the design to come up with something aesthetically as well as functioning well structurally to explore the design and try and find the best solution. Again, it works parametrically with the property table in Rhino, and is a useful means then of generating and creating, as I said, the structural model for if you have to analyze it to see how strong or how far it's deflecting, what size the individual elements are that compose that arch for strength and for design purposes. And as I said, when we were doing the checks and things like that on the arch, we simply just used trigonometry and geometry checks in it, or calculations in a spreadsheet to try and generate that form, which of course you can come up with the answer, but it's not very flexible to change. So at the time anyway, it was quite difficult to explore or realize variations or try and find a better answer. You were very much hampered by the technology, whereas was trying to model this type of structure in Grasshopper would give you a lot more freedom and instant ability to explore. So again, like I said, that's the component that comes with the plugin that I've written for Grasshopper, where it effectively does that sweeping along a curve, whether it be a straight line or helix or whatever else, and then is parametrically generated within your Grasshopper definition. I'm just going to quickly introduce then a couple of other aspects that for form and computational geometry type calculation that I've added in, some in response to showing examples of how other structures and things have been done. Tessellation or polygon packing was one of them, and I should have said a lot of these things you can download the files, the Grasshopper definition, etc. from the blog, which I'll quickly put the address up again at the end, and try for yourself. So the Beijing water cube was quite a stunning example of a novel piece of architecture where they effectively did that molecular cell packing of a volume, and then they actually rotated it around 2 axes and then intersected it with the rectangle that formed the facade of the water cube, and that gives that soap cell water type appearance that was prominent and I thought looked quite nice in the facade. So parametrically now that sort of operation's available in Grasshopper via the plugin. You can generate surfaces or polygons. You can generate a wireframe, which has been used a little bit in some atriums and that type of lattice or grid structure. And as I said, or you can also have options for the way it generates, in that you can either fill a rectangle or sphere, a rectangle or space, or you can ask just to generate the polygons and things that intersect a particular surface or target set of surfaces. So effectively, if we want to atomize a cone, there's a couple of different variations for the actual polygon packing, the shapes and sizes and the nature of the polygons. And effectively, you can atomize it. So, and if you picked a smaller size for the actual polygon pack, then you get a slightly more accurate realization of that cone. Voronoi diagrams and things have been quite popular in architecture, which is similarly related to the water cube, etc. But it was the Ware-Felin polygon pack. I've done a couple of other routines because you can do Voronoi and you can produce the cells and things by the polygons formed by that diagram. But this one actually works on any curved network without necessarily having identified the closed boundary of the polygon. So these are all just single curves forming this network, and basically the routine identifies the curves, works out the perimeter, and works out the voids in that area, and then gives you options for generating the cell. You can specify an offset, you can specify a radius, and this has actually been used a little bit even by furniture makers and things, and they would take that polysurface and boolean out of a plane and produce quite a nice back for a chair or other aspects of say, furniture or architecture. So that was being used a little bit. And there's also things like generating geodesic domes, etc. The routine for that cell filleting doesn't just work for planar networks. It will work for any curved network. So if I've calculated a buckyball geodesic dome there, it's a bit hard to see in the green, I'm sorry. But there's a wireframe, and it has calculated those cell patterns in between that wireframe. And again, the variations of geodesic domes, you can specify whether it's a buckyball, whether it's just a triangulated curved network, and you can change the frequency, you can change the various settings of the geodesic domes, which again has been used in some architecture like the Garden of Eden, etc. in Cornwall. And then I'll just show, because Daniel's actually going to show a lot more sophisticated, or maybe it's a big part of his Kangaroo plugin, but I'm going to show just a little bit on form finding and mesh relaxation as well. There's a pretty decent example of mesh relaxation not too far from here at the British Museum. My version looks a bit heavier and casting a bit more of a solid shadow. I don't think I quite got the member size as light as what they did. But effectively letting the mesh relax itself so that you get those nice sweeping curves, which gives quite a stunning shape. It's for finding things like Costa's minimum surface or a more generic mesh relaxation surface, which I've seen in a couple of atrium installations. And there was some nice work by a young student in Germany who, I originally basically wrote the routine thinking, that's a bad example of a tent or membrane type roof, but he used it for finding some quite nice organic shapes, so it can do some pretty powerful stuff. So I'm going to finish just quickly to show then just one example for that particular generic minimum surface. So again, it's just a standard Grasshopper type component. You'll actually let Rhino mesh the poly surface. And the way my routine is very simple. It requires basically no technical input. It just requires a mesh, and any mesh node that exists on a free edge, so the boundaries of these cylinders, etc., will remain fixed. And any node on that mesh that's internal on that surface is free to move and shake itself into that smoothed or organic mesh relaxation. So visually, this component here is going to demonstrate and redraw the mesh at each particular calculation. So this is a force density or dynamic relaxation routine. And what you'll see, again, like an evolution process, etc., this is just a linear solver, though. It's getting a better answer each time. So the nodes are effectively dragging each other around the surface until you see it start to take shape and produce a smooth, continuous surface. Okay, it gets, obviously the movements get smaller and smaller until it converges on an answer. Okay, as I said, I mean, that's just a quick introduction into some of the tools and techniques and areas of work I've been working on. But more than welcome to come find me after this presentation, or I'm available in the next few weeks. I'm doing a various number of office visits, or I can come back to here if there's particular interest or need to learn more about it. Simply Rhino are helping with arranging a lot of the office meetings. And as I said, if you like to learn more or try that, the blog is probably the best place to start. There's a number of YouTube clips. As you said, you can download the Grasshopper and Rhino files and try it for yourself with the examples I've presented. And then, if you have the need or desire or try and apply it to your own work or design, that would be great. So thanks a lot for your time.
A few years ago, but after studying architecture for a few years, I found I was getting more and more interested in the computational geometric aspects of it, and starting from little bits of scripting and writing my own tools. Last few years I've been doing that more independently, and this is my latest project. It's called Kangaroo, and the idea is to embed realistic physical simulation directly in the 3D modeling environment. And the idea of that is that you can then use it as you're actually designing, not just to inform the design, but also to find the kinds of shapes that are sometimes hard to model purely geometrically, and also so as well as informing the design, you can actually create designs which are driven by the physical forces themselves. Now, most of you here are probably familiar with ideas of form finding and the work of Gaudi and Otto and Heinz Eisler. And I think it's an amazingly powerful but simple idea that you can find a form by making it directly in response to the forces it has to resist. And originally this was done a lot through these physical models with soap films and hanging chains, because the thing about making a form in response to the forces is that you change the form according to the force, and then the forces change and you have to loop through, which can be difficult to do through straightforward calculation, and for a while these kind of actual analog models were really the only practical way to do it. But in the last few decades, computer power has increased. That's made it possible to do this. It's not, I won't say real time, but live and fast enough to be interactive, so you can actually get feedback as you're doing it and change something and see the effects of it in terms of how the physics change straight away. So I think really one of the amazingly rewarding things about programming Newtonian physics, this is all classical mechanics, is that you, from very few very simple rules, you actually get behavior which is recognizable on a kind of intuitive level as something like what you see in the real world. And I think a lot of the techniques I've borrowed and learnt from stuff that's been developed for the gaming industry, because they're always trying to make stuff intuitive and interactive, and I think that actually has real applications. It's fun, but I think toys can be tools, and that's a really important part of what I'm doing, is that the things that make good toys actually make good tools for us to use, because they're very flexible and they encourage exploration. And actually, when you interact with them in this very direct way, I think it's useful in terms of building up our intuition, because we have this internal model of what physics is, and when we can actually sort of take that further by simulating it on the computer, then we can develop our intuition, get a bit more of an idea of how structures can behave. So it's just showing how the forces balance out, so you can see what the reaction forces are in your structure and change it and really learn as you go along. Using it through Grasshopper is really, it's been the ideal environment to explore this kind of stuff in, that it's very plug and play, and that example is just showing how everything you do in the physics simulation can be connected to the whole of the rest of your parametric model, whatever it is. You can have a bit of physics driving a system which is then panelled using all your Grasshopper tools. And also the inputs can come from anything else you generate in Grasshopper. And I really like seeing all the stuff that people are doing to bring all sorts of interesting new methods of inputting or getting data into Grasshopper. And then people with absolutely no knowledge of programming can start doing that. Because before, these tools for simulation have been around for a long time, but they've not always been accessible to people without a technical background. So I really want to make at least basic structural analysis and form finding tools available to designers, to people like you. In terms of structural design, and that's one of the applications of it, but these ideas of self-forming patterns is really something else I'm really interested in exploring through the physical simulation tools. And the idea of you can mimic forms in nature, but really if you have a physical environment, then you can start to mimic more the actual processes. And this has been an image that I keep coming back to. I've always been fascinated. It's just showing how the way that on the right you've got the bone, and it forms perfectly along the stress lines of the structure. And this was an engineer using that as a design for a crane. But I really am interested in using this kind of emergent quality of physical simulation. This is some other interesting analog form-finding experiments. And I've been going, a lot of what I'm interested in doing is revisiting some of these techniques, and when you can do them virtually, seeing that can change some things, because you can actually then alter the properties to things which aren't quite the same as physical properties, and sort of twist it and reconnect it in new ways. It's just an example of some self-organisation, showing how all the balls are attracted to each other, but they also have a limit. When they get closer than a certain limit, they repel each other, so they act like solid balls, and they find their way into a hexagon pattern. And lots also, I've been interested for a long time in deployable structures and transforming structures, things which obviously the physics plays a very important part, not just in seeing what the stresses are, but actually determining the force to begin with. And really I'm looking forward to seeing how people use it, and hoping that people do more of that kind of stuff. In terms of the future, there's going to be, I'm still developing it. Greg, who should be here somewhere. Yeah, this is Greg Epps. We're going to be teaching a workshop. He's has a company, RoboFold, and he's a specialist in curve folding, and we're talking about how this can be combined with Grasshopper. So we'll be announcing details of that fairly soon, and talk to me or Greg about that, and visit the website if you're interested. In terms of what's next for Grasshopper, the big one, for Kangaroo in Grasshopper, is I'm still developing it independently in my spare time, basically. The big one, which I know people need, is an instruction manual of anyone who's started using it. I've tried to make it as simple as possible, but I think it can be clearer, and also that will play also the role of describing some of the basic physics and the principles that are behind it. Also, people are very, I think, extending it at the moment. It's all particles and forces between pairs of particles, but I'm going to work on putting in beam and surface elements, which will allow a lot more powerful analysis of a variety of structures, including hopefully pneumatic and inflatable structures, and also the origami and bending of sheet materials is something I've been working on a lot. Really excited to try connecting it to Galapagos. Not done it yet, but I think evolving things which are actually being affected by real-world physical forces could be something fun to do. The biggest challenge, biggest sort of technical hurdle at the moment is realistic stiffnesses. It's everything so far has to be a little bit like jelly. It's all a bit bouncy, and you have a control for the stiffness of materials, but as you increase the stiffness, it sometimes will cause it all to explode. Then you slow down, and you can get around it by slowing down the time. But and there's a lot of maths behind that it's a big challenge to work on. But the aim of doing that would be that you could then have real-world properties and give materials masses in kilograms and forces in newtons, and then it could connect to something like John's tools, so you could actually go back and forth between a real analysis program and actually work with real materials a lot more. Other types of optimization, I've always, as I said, the bone thing I've been interested in, so I'd like to look at more ways that things can be not just deformed by the forces, but they can actually move towards places where the force is most needed, and where the resistance is most needed to the force. And finally, your suggestions. It's a huge field. Physics is many different things, but if anybody's got ideas for stuff they'd like to see and they would like to be able to use it for, then please let me know. I'll stop there. You can follow it on the blog. Thank you. Any questions? I guess we're going to have some more general discussion now. But are there any particular questions?
Hello, everybody. We are students from Inter10, and we're going to show 3 projects that we've been doing. Basically, we are developing some projects for Dubai. So our site is the World Lagoon in Dubai. We have some pictures. This is the World Lagoon in Dubai, and so we've been experimenting with Grasshopper to develop a sort of some like a systemic master plans and very interesting experimentation that you will see very soon.
Well, hi, my name is Seeker, and I'm gonna attempt to briefly just show an overview of my project. Actually, my project is attempting to actually mediate with the sedimentation issues that are occurring in the islands due to the non-consolidating soils. This is as a result of the rainbow blasting of the of sand in order to reclaim the land. I develop a Grasshopper script that actually, in order to mediate with these sort of sedimentation issues, I'm trying to use actually biomass and trying to implement the actual coral grow on site to interact with actually dynamics of the sedimentation. Don't actually stop in the sedimentation, but actually attempting to mediate with it and attempt to reshape the actual island, constantly reshape the actual island. Here I develop a script that is actually receiving certain information in terms of the actual bathymetry and the current speed, and creating an input that actually allow me to regulate the actual ingrow of the occupational path as a way of mediating with the sedimentation. Okay, here is actually a simulation of the actual, in order to start developing, which actually the efficiency of these sand pockets I'm trying to create using the actual metable definition. Yeah. And yeah, just leave it on. Okay. Here is actually a rough explanation of the relationship of the actual natural processes occurring, and in terms of how I'm trying to link that into my Grasshopper parametrics. You can see the relationship between the actual speed in relation to the bathymetry, and actually how that creates certain levels of conditions in each different level, and how those actually affect the actual growth of the actual biomass in different levels, and then how that actually interacts in the actual cell's perimeter grow, and interacting in order of efficiency in terms of mediating with the sand. Yeah. Well, the material system I'm planning to implement for the actual coral grow and the sedimentation mediation is already existing material system, which is the actual reef bowl. And I'm planning to develop, use these two type of reef bowl. One is actually to create artificial reef, and the other is to plant mangroves in a very intelligent way around the actual perimeter in order to mediate with the dynamics. Here is a rough schematic of the actual programmation. And then also I'm trying to research in terms of actually the natural processes of implementing a living architecture and using the actual plantation of mangrove in the perimeter of the island, and develop certain sort of connectivity between the islands, and as well attempt to develop certain spatial qualities by developing, pushing forward these sort of type of technique by using living trees. And here is an attempt using a Grasshopper definition I developed to using attractors in order to develop, which is the based on the concept of Fryoto and the optimal path and connectivity, in order to develop a more efficient path with less detours and better connectivity. And this is one video, which is one of my first attempts of my Grasshopper definition, trying to actually link the minimal path, but linking to as well to the data I input earlier using the current. Yeah, just put it. Well, that's all. That's a rough overview of my project. Thank you.
Okay, hi, my name's Zach. So my project began by looking at soap bubbles and the deformation that would happen when magnets were compressing them within a box. So I looked at it over a timeline of having up to 7 magnets. This is using 5 here, and I then compared that with the Voronoi diagram. From here, obviously, we've seen the world. Within the world there, I picked the Maldives as my site, and I chose this site for various reasons. The main one being the depth of surrounding the islands and its proximity to other ones. And to create this, this diagram here, I'll show it a little bit better here. It was, I used the points along the topography and then based the Voronoi off of that. And creating this series of cells, and this series of cells was used in order to look at this material called biorock and how basically biorock accretes around a galvanized steel bar that has electric current passing through it. And what was interesting to me was the rate at which it grows, which is roughly 50 millimeters a year, and that can depend on salinity and amount of current. It doesn't need much current. It needs between 5 and 15 watts, and it has a compression strength of concrete. So from here, I created this grasshopper diagram here that is kind of twofold. It simulates using this metaball function accretion. But it also, in this definition, shows in the production line of how this architecture would be built. So it has direct, it works directly with an architect and a marine biologist and a structural engineer being the main basis of it, and their kind of collaboration effect to create these building components. So from there, and knowing its growth rate, and having my my site, I divided it into 4 or 5 different area sizes and created a series of bars, which I would then grow this or accrete this biorock on, and looked at over a 3-year rate and how that could, when say the rock could be matured and mined out of the water and other variabilities in its growth. And then kind of looking at basically how it could almost accrete this carpet over top of the Maldives in the world, which in similar respect to the actual Maldives, which is sinking, to kind of make this solid barrier over top of it. And then, so I have really 2 main videos kind of exploring how if they were working together, this growth rate could happen and form this this building material and carpet over top of the islands. And this one takes a while to get going, but basically just looking at, and I let it run all the way out just to see possible differences in when they would attach, when they would be solidified. And that's it.
Mine is the third project that is going to be presented. And okay, so my project consisted basically in the invention of an authentic Arabic public space. So the idea was basically that, as you all know, Dubai is known only for like a sort of tacky tourism and very ugly shopping malls. But instead, in Dubai, this new development that is basically the World Lagoon is very interesting actually right now, because due to the crisis, basically the islands are not currently being developed. So it's sort of a massive, unfinished landscape project. So we took this sort of instance to develop instead, like as you probably noticed, very like experimental architectures. So my idea was basically I first looked at self-organization processes in nature. So I started to look at electric field and how the electric field affect, can be sort of a prototype of an Arabic public space. So basically, the idea is to interpret the space as a sort of I don't know, like as a sort of field in which you have different intensities and different conditions that define a very rich, differentiated space. So I assigned to the different charges that sort of build the field different programmatic intensity, because the idea is that in my project, sort of the form is the result of an accumulation of energy. So here you see some photomonad actualizations of a project, because the idea was to use these aggregate structures to materialize this field condition in a structure that is not only that is responding and interpreting the richness of the system, because an aggregate structure behaves basically in the same way as a magnetic field or any other self-organizing process. So the interesting thing was that there is a sort of loop in the scale in the project, because basically the structure behaves in the same way that sand does. Here is another view of the project. So you have these clusters and this type of spaces. This is a catalog with that these has been developed with Grasshopper, in which you can fully explore the parametric potential and the adaptability of the system according to different programs. And this is an analog model that I developed. So the interesting thing is that how you translate basically a very complex parametric model into a fairly experimental physical model. So the idea is that the physical model doesn't have to lose all the power of the digital one, which is not so common, I think. This is other views of the project. And then I have two videos to show that show how the metaball, which is something that I know that everybody said that it was hot in the 90s, but I think it's still hot now. So basically, I use the metaball not as a sort of shape, but as an algorithm that can plot distances and spatial relationships. So this is the first one, the first video. So you see that the magnetic field is sort of the basic spatial diagram, and then this accretion happens according to the position in the three-dimensional space of the points on the lines. Okay, this is not fine. And then, yeah, you know, the video showing, yeah, basically the same thing. But instead here I have the particles moving instead of just, yeah. Okay, finished.